Today's Q&A is about tartaric acid, and the question is that someone told me that tartaric acid made from non-kosher wine is used in kosher food. And how in the world could that be? How could it be that something from non-kosher wine could end up being in a kosher food? So the answer is that actually it's true, and I'm going to explain, in order to explain why many people hold that that's appropriate. I'm going to have to dig a little into the halachas of stam yayin, non-kosher wine, a little deeper than we might otherwise usually do in these kind of Q&As. So it goes as follows. The Gemara says that if you had seeds left over from a non-kosher wine production and they dry out for 12 months, those seeds are now permitted. Even though the wine was not kosher, the seeds become permitted. And most understand that the same is true even if you don't wait the 12 months, but instead you find a way to mechanically dry out those seeds. That's just as good. Now, Rabbeinu Tam says that this leniency, this kula, is only in cases where the person first soaked or rinsed the seeds to make something called temed. Temed is like something that's like wine. It's extracted from all the leftovers from wine. You rinse these things out and you flow water through them to get something out of it that's sort of like wine. So first you have to make this temed with these seeds, and then dry them out. That's what makes them mutter. But if you just dried straight, you just took it right out of the winemaking and you dried it, that would not be good enough. And the Shulchan Aruch in Halacha Yudalad, Kuf Chav Gimel Halacha Yudalad, agrees with this and says that that's correct. Now, 2 halachas later, that's Halacha Tezvav, he brings a Rajba, who's also talking about the same idea, and he says, well, you're allowed to use, if you have barrels that were used for non-kosher wine, and on the sides of the barrel, these crystals form on the sides of the barrel, that they get sort of like left behind on the barrel. You can use those barrels, even though the barrel had been previously used for non-kosher wine, you could use it for kosher wine without taking those crystals off. Now, those crystals are so dried out that even in modern days, when we try to get them off, they use jackhammers and chisels to break them off. That's how hard and dry they are. So he says these are so dry that even Rabbeinu Tam, who said dried out is not good enough, you have to do this temed process and then dry it out. In this case, he would agree because it's so dried out that you're allowed to use it even without making this temed thing first. Okay, that's a disagreement. That's some different things brought in Shulchan Aruch. Now, nowadays, those crystals that are formed on the side of the barrel are what we call tartaric acid. And tartaric acid is used in winemaking where it lowers pH. It's used as a dough conditioner for bread. It's used in soft drinks. It's really good for grape and lime flavors where it adds tartness to the food. And it's used in other places also. And it's also the precursor for something called cream of tartar. Now, it used to be that, as I mentioned, they would literally chisel it off the sides of the barrels to get this tartaric acid. But what happened is that worked fine when wine was stored in wooden barrels or even in cement tanks. But when winemakers started using stainless steel, all of a sudden they found out that there was no more tartaric acid. The crystals just didn't form on the side didn't attach themselves to the tank. So they figured out a chemical process through which they could get tartaric acid from all the leftovers from winemaking, the peels and the pits and whatever else is left over. They found a way to get the tartaric acid out of those items. Now, so the question is that kosher or is it not kosher? Rebelsky said this tartaric acid made from those in the more modern way is the same as what the Rajba said. It's dried out, and since it's so dried out, you're allowed to use this tartaric acid even though it came from non-kosher wine. Now, most of the national hashgachas in the United States accept that, and they would allow that kind of a product into a kosher food. But in Eretz Yisrael and in many American, what they call Hamish hashgachas, they will not accept tartaric acid or cream of tartar as kosher unless it came from kosher wine. So what's going on? What's the difference of opinion over here? Why someone should be lenient or strict? Why would someone be strict and not follow what Rabbi Belsky said? So there's 3 main reasons to disagree with what Rabbi Belsky said, that this should be the same as the dried out case that the Rajba said. First is the Darkei Tshuva has a disagreement about whether remember the case of the Rajba was to use a barrel that had these crystals on it. And that's what the case that he said is permitted. And the question is, did the Rashba only permit a barrel, or did he even permit the actual tartaric acid itself to use it as a food item? Okay, the case of the Rashba, the case that the Shulchan Aruch brings, is where it was just to use the barrel. So that's one. One is that some people hold you can only use the barrel. You're not allowed to actually use it as a food ingredient. Second is, in Minchas Yitzchak, he follows a Taz who says that the Rashba who said this only meant it b'di'evet. If it was already done, then you can be lenient. But not that you should do this lechatchila. You shouldn't choose to use this product. And Rabbi Belsky said no. Other poskim can disagree, and they say that you could use it even lechatchila. And the last reason to potentially disagree with Rabbi Belsky is that the if you think about what happened with the Rashba and Rabbeinu Tam was, Rabbeinu Tam says being dry is not good enough. It needs to have this temed-like process before it gets dry. And the Rashba says, you know what, Rabbeinu Tam is right, but if it gets super dry, extra dry, then that's when it's going to be much, even without doing this temed-like process. And Rabbi Belsky is trying to say that this tartaric acid is the same as the super dry of what the Rashba said. Well, not so clear. What's the difference between dry and super dry? Like, what's the cutoff? What's the one that Rabbeinu Tam says is only permitted with the temed-like process, and the Rashba said is even drier and it's more mutter. And even if we knew what the cutoff is, how well do we know about how the tartaric acid is and whether it's reached that process? It's very vague here as to whether to say that our tartaric acid that's made nowadays qualifies for a Rashba is not so clear that it actually meets that standard. So those are reasons why people would disagree with Rabbi Belsky. But however, it is worth noting that there's an alternate reason to permit tartaric acid, and that is the whole time we've been talking about that this should be permitted based on the Rashba that the Shulchan Aruch brings in Halacha Tes Vav that if it's super dry, then it's mutter even if it didn't make it like temet. But another reason to permit it is because of Rabbeinu Tam, who's brought in Halacha Yudaled, which we mentioned, which is Rabbeinu Tam says when the Gemara says dried out seeds, etc., are permitted, that means if it went through a temed-like process. Well, but actually the process of making tartaric acid from all these leftovers from the winemaking, the peels on the pits and the leaves, the palms, all this kind of stuff, actually the first step in that part of that process is to recover as much as you can and all kinds of wine or grape-like useful residue off of these off these leftovers. It's for financial reasons. That stuff is worth much more than the tartaric acid is, or any other tartaric acid will come later. So they do whatever they can. They wash it, they steam, distillation, all kinds of things are done to get as much out of it. And actually, all that happens before they start making tartaric acid out of it. So actually, turns out that the tartaric acid from these leftovers is permitted not necessarily because of the Rashba, but we can argue about whether that's correct or not correct to permit it based on the Rashba. We can permit it based on Rabbeinu Tam and the way Shulchan Aruch and Halacha Yudaled, which is that since it actually goes through a temed-like process, after which it gets dried out, and in that case, all should agree that the tartaric acid should be permitted, even if it comes from non-kosher wine.